This is the part that everybody is taking out of context and trying to use to say that Pope Francis is saying that SSPX is not in schism. And I'm going to show the spin that they're putting on it. And I'm going to point out something that nobody so far has picked up on, and to their shame. And I can't believe it because it's so explicitly clear. It's so abundantly clear. You can't watch this in context and miss what he's trying to say and see how it's different than the spin that people are putting on it. Okay, let's watch it.
Der Krise begegnen und der Kirche damit beistehen wollte. Ihm war es
So he was mainly concerned with the faith of the church and the insecure and abandoned faithful. Talking about Lefebvre.
vor allem am Glauben der Kirche gelegen. Ihm war es an den verunsicherten und verlassenen Gläubigen gelegen. Im Anschluss an
Following what happened after Vatican II,
die Entwicklung nach dem Zweiten Vatikanischen Konzil wurden viele Menschen,
many people became sheep without shepherd. For the Archbishop, the reason for action was primarily
Schafe ohne Hirten. Der Grund zum Handeln war für den Erzbischof in erster Linie das Heil der Seele.
the salvation of souls as well as the preservation of the purity of the faith. Okay, so this is important because this is the context. He's saying that Lefebvre's main motivation and intention was not to somehow break with the church, violate canon law, corrupt the faith, lead people to hell, create a schism. No, his main intention was to preserve the faith and also to secure the salvation of souls. That's important because this comes up a lot with the SSPX in context. Canon law is there to serve the salvation of souls, not the other way around, right? Kind of like the Sabbath is made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Canon law is made for the salvation of souls, not salvation of souls is made for canon law. And what the SSPX are going to argue is that, look, some of these canonical procedures and some of the regulations there in canon law, they're not necessarily conducive to the salvation of souls in these extraordinary circumstances. Therefore, in some cases, we have to not obey this particular canon and not work within that particular canon because ultimately the salvation of souls is at stake, and that's what needs to be given priority over canon law. And very theoretically speaking, that's true. I don't agree that any of that applies to what Lefebvre actually did. But it's certainly true that canon law is there for the salvation of souls, not the other way around. So the bishop is basically saying, look, that was his intention. It's not to break away with the church, not to break with canon law. It's not to just thumb his nose at the Pope. No, his primary motivation was for the salvation of souls and the purity of faith. And you know what? I'll grant that. I really do believe that that's the case. I don't think that gets him off the hook because I really think that that's also the case for Martin Luther. I really do think that you could say the exact same thing about Martin Luther. Not that Luther and Lefebvre are in the same category. I think Luther was way worse than Lefebvre. But I could certainly say that, Luther intended to, save souls. He believed that he was preserving the faith, and he's just wrong. But that's the context. So pay attention to the context and then listen to what he says next.
Seelen. Ebenso die Erhaltung der Reinheit des Glaubens. Denn der Glaube ist
For faith is the path to salvation. Therefore it must not be falsified. It is from this principle.
der Weg zum Heil. Darf daher nicht verfälscht werden. Von diesem Grundsatz aus muss die Bruderschaft und ihr Gründer
It is from this principle that the SSPX and its founder must be viewed and judged. It is in this sense, let me repeat, it is in this sense that
betrachtet und beurteilt werden. In diesem Sinn hat sich Papst Franziskus
Pope Francis spoke to me and said they, that is the SSPX, are not schismatics. Full stop. Full stop. What most people are doing right now, they're not even going to the video. And if they are, they're just showing a screenshot of this. They're not showing you everything that just came up to that point. And I'll show you why that's significant. They're just saying, look, right there, Pope says SSPX are not schismatics. There's at least 3 problems that I could think of here. Number 1, he said, in this sense. In what sense? In the sense that the intention and motivation of Lefebvre, and we could even say by extension, ministers and priests who adhere to the SSPX, their intention is the salvation of souls. Their intention is not to operate as suspended priests. Their intention is not to violate canon law. Their intention is not to thumb their nose at the Pope. Their intention is not to be disobedient. Their intention is, first of all, the salvation of souls. And I would say, yeah, that's probably true of a lot of SSPX priests. I would even grant that that's true of Lefebvre, even though objectively he's still violating canon law, and these priests are still violating canon law. I imagine their intention is good, and it's for the salvation of souls. In their intention, in this sense, they're not schismatics. In the subjective sense, they're not intending to be in schism. And you know what? I agree with Pope Francis. I agree with him. And I've been saying that, by the way. I've been making this distinction. I agree that your average SSPX priest out there, and even Lefebvre himself, they don't intend to be in schism for Christ Church. I really don't think that that's the primary motivation. I think that they really do believe that they're preserving the faith and that they're doing this for the necessity of the sake of souls and their salvation. That's the intention. But that doesn't remove their canonical and objective status as being in a state of schism. And Pope Francis never said otherwise. So if Pope Francis actually said this, we can agree with him and still say that the SSPX is in schism. Objectively speaking and canonically speaking, the group as a whole is in schism. Does that mean that every individual or even its founder they're somehow intending to be in schism? No. I don't think that their intention is necessarily schismatic. Objectively, are they in schism? Yes. I can say the same thing for an Eastern Orthodox priest. I really do believe that your average Orthodox priest does not intend to be in schism from Christ Church. I really don't believe that that's their motivation. I don't think that they really have formally adopted a schismatic mentality. I just don't believe that. In speaking to so many Orthodox priests, that's not their intention. But objectively, are they in a state of schism? Yes. Yes, of course they are. Objectively. Canonically, objectively, Orthodox priests are in a state of schism. Subjectively and in intention, I really don't believe the majority of Orthodox priests are in schism. I can again say the same thing for people who are in the SSPX. So what people are doing is they're ripping it out of context and they're giving the impression that Pope Francis is saying that somehow canonically and objectively speaking, they're not in schism. He doesn't say that even according to this bishop. He doesn't say that. According to this bishop, all he's saying is in the intention, in the interior disposition, that's not where their heart is at. Their heart is for the salvation of souls, and he's right. Their intentions are not schismatic on the whole. Maybe you got some SSPX people out there, they actually do have evil intentions and they do intend to be in schism. Like maybe there's a few of them out there, but I just don't think that that's the case with the majority of people who are in schism. I just don't believe that. But it doesn't take away from the fact that canonically they still are in schism. Number 2. The other problem with this is, so not only are people putting a spin on it that is foreign to the video itself, they're taking it out of context. Number 2, we don't have a direct quote of what Pope Francis said. So I'm having to go based on what this bishop is saying and how he interpreted Pope Francis. Since I don't have a direct quote, it could be that he misinterpreted something that he heard Pope Francis say. And given how incredibly sympathetic and how much he's effectively bought into the tenets of the SSPX, I am inclined to suspect that he probably interpreted whatever Pope Francis said in a skewed way. So could be that Pope Francis actually said this, and even if Pope Francis said that in the sense that Pope Francis said it, according to the bishop, that's true. It doesn't remove it from the fact that they're still objectively in schism when it comes to the objective realm and canon law. But I do have some questions on whether or not Pope Francis even said that, since we don't have a direct quote, and since I very clearly see in this video that the bishop has an agenda, and that probably would skew the way he interprets something that Pope Francis said. Pope Francis could have very well said something about, the intention or the interior of people who are in the SSPX. They're not schismatics in that sense. And he could have taken that to mean, therefore, they're not in schism, objectively speaking. So that's also a problem here. We don't have a direct quote, and I'm not so sure that I'm very confident in his interpretation. Last part here. Third part. Even if, let's say, the Pope said something like, well, even canonically and objectively speaking, they're not in schism. Let's just go with that, even though I have no reason to believe that, and I actually have reason to believe the contrary. Let's just go with that. That all that would do is that would just show that the Pope is mistaken in his assessment of the SSPX. And mistaken evaluations of somebody is not authoritative, and it doesn't overturn their canonical state. Pope Francis would have to actually put that into canon law for it to be authoritative. Now, if Pope Francis came out tomorrow and put into canon law, like they're regularized, they are in full communion, okay, all right, that's authoritative, and he's right, and we have to assent to that. But if Pope Francis were to just say that and not promulgate it, that's not authoritative, and it doesn't overturn the facts. One other thing. Why are people going with hearsay, and then even so, hearsay out of context, hearsay over and against what Pope Francis has actually directly and explicitly said? Why? We have the direct words of Pope Francis elsewhere in his thoughts of the SSPX. Let me give you an example. For one, look at this. Letter of the Holy Father Francis to the bishops of the whole world that accompanies the apostolic motu proprio, Traditionis Custodes. I know I've spoken about this in other videos, but for those who are not familiar, here he directly says, the faculty granted to the indult of the Congregation for Divine Worship in 1984 and confirmed by St. John Paul II in the motu proprio Ecclesia Dei in 1888 was above all motivated by the desire to foster the healing of the schism with the movement of Lefebvre. Schism. He explicitly calls it a schism there. Now, in defense of somebody who adheres to the SSPX, they could say, well, what he's saying is at the time that Lefebvre did this, Francis believes that, they were in schism. So at the time of the illicit consecrations, and at the time that his excommunication was authoritatively confirmed, Pope Francis believes there was a schism then. But Pope Francis is nowhere saying that that schism remains now, and they would try to argue that the SSPX is no longer in schism now, at the very least. At least within the mind of Francis. So I agree this isn't a slam dunk that Pope Francis thinks they're currently in a state of schism. All this would prove is he at the very least thinks that at one point in time there was a schism with the SSPX. He's not necessarily saying that there's still a schism with the SSPX based on this alone. So I do want to steel man the SSPX position there, because I think some people miss that and they quote this as if it's a slam dunk against the SSPX. And I just think, well, not exactly, and for the reason why I just mentioned. No, it could be that Pope Francis intends this to mean that even now it's still in schism. But we actually have something else from Pope Francis that will clarify things. This is from Pope Francis in 2016. So obviously, again, recent as far as Pope Francis's understanding of the SSPX. Misericordia et Misera, 2016. And here he says this, and shout out to Andrew Bartell, who mentioned this about a month ago in his Catholic World Report article engaging this issue. He says, for the Jubilee year, I had also granted that those faithful who, for various reasons, attend churches officiated by the priests of the Fraternity of St. Pius X can validly and licitly receive the sacramental absolution of their sins. For the pastoral benefit of these faithful, and here's the kicker, and trusting in the goodwill of their priests to strive with God's help for the recovery of full communion in the Catholic Church, I personally decided to extend this faculty beyond the Jubilee year. He's saying, look, the reason why I'm trying to, and I am making their previously invalid confessions now valid and licit, the reason why I'm doing that is I'm hoping that SSPX priests will regularize themselves and come into full communion with the Catholic Church. Now, think about that for a second. If you are a member of the clergy and you're not in full communion, by definition, you're in schism. You might not be in schism to the degree of, somebody else, perhaps maybe an Eastern Orthodox priest, because I think they have additional impediments. But if you're not in full communion and you're a member of the clergy, there's still a degree to which you are in schism, by definition, by virtue of the fact that you're not in full communion and you're operating outside of that full communion. That is why there is still an element of schism here, objectively. Now, on the subjective level, a priest who operates this way, on the subjective level, are they necessarily formalizing schism in their heart? Not necessarily. I can't judge that. I have to assume no, unless there's really good reason to believe otherwise. I assume no, and I leave it up to God to judge whether or not they've willfully formalized schism in their hearts. But I can still say objectively they're in schism. Again, the Orthodox priest, I assume the majority of them don't intend to be in schism. So I'm not judging them on the personal and culpable level. There may not be personal sin involved, even though objectively speaking, they're in an objective realm of sin because schism is sin. So that's important because that tells us what Pope Francis thinks of them even after granting lyceity and validity to their confessions. That does also mean all of their sacraments. He's specifically here talking about confession. So even after this, he still believes they're not in full communion. And again, if you're a member of the clergy and you are operating in a ministerial fashion without the authorization of the church, and there are many ways in which they still operate without the authorization of the church, even after this, and you're not in full communion, then objectively speaking, you're in a state of schism. It may not be as bad as some others, but you're still objectively in a state of schism. You may not necessarily be personally culpable and going to hell, but you're still objectively in a state of schism, and you need to regularize that and fix it, because who wants to, really bank on that, right? Just because there may be a mitigation in circumstances and an ignorance there, who really wants to bank on that? Only God knows the heart ultimately. And even sometimes we can deceive ourselves with our own heart and our own evaluation of our heart. So we always want to do everything that we can to regularize ourselves with God's law through his church and to fully reconcile ourselves with Christ and his church. So why is it that we are going to out of context quotes that are, out of context hearsay that is not even a direct quote, and it's again out of context? Why are we using that to somehow override objective, direct, explicitly clear words from Pope Francis elsewhere? I'll tell you why. I'll tell you why people are doing this. Some are doing so out of ignorance because they didn't know that they put a spin, or somebody else has put a spin on what the bishop said, or that they're hearing hearsay. Others, I imagine, have an agenda, and that is to try to act like there isn't a schism with the SSPX. They're doing everything they can in their power to try to say there's no schism here, when in reality, there is. There still is. Again, see the SSPX playlist where I talk about this in more detail there. Hey friends, are you thinking about converting to Eastern Orthodoxy? If so, I have the book just for you. It's called Answering Orthodoxy. In this book, I engage all of the objections that Eastern Orthodox have against the Catholic Church. I respond to all of them, refute them, and I show why the Catholic Church alone possesses the fullness of the faith. Get your copy today at shop.catholic.com. Hey friends, do you want others to discover why the Catholic Church is the church that Jesus established? And do you want to help people make sense of all the confusion in the Catholic Church today? Help contribute to this mission by supporting Reason and Theology at patreon.com/Reason and Theology. By doing so, you'll also get access to exclusive content for patrons only. Also, if you want to deepen your faith, there are free ebooks and even courses that you can sign up for by visiting reason.podia.com.